Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 107 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin, and I made a little bit of a mistake when we actually recorded this episode. It recorded through not my good mic, no, that'd be too easy and would make sense. No, it recorded through a webcam that I have plugged in for some reason that I don't know because I haven't used it in a while. But anyway, it recorded through that, and the mic's not even facing me, so my audio quality is really, really bad. So sorry about that, but hopefully this episode is still enjoyable enough for you. But just wanted to let you know that ahead of time that you're not going crazy. My mic is weird. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode 107 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin and Fia. And Fia, do you feel like an official Louisianan now that you've made it through Mardi Gras?
I really do, man. I really do. First of all, I went to 4 Mardi Gras parades, which was
Love it.
maximum amount that I could do socially. But
Are you a parade person?
no, not really. I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
So this was big for me. But getting to be in a parade was probably the highlight for sure. I think I was overwhelmed within the first 5 minutes because the amount of gratitude that you get from giving children toys and stuff is just, it's so much. Like, you get to see how excited they are, and like when you give like a special like stuffed animal or something to like this little kid and their face lights up, like it's just like, I get it now.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really understand like the point of parades too much before, but like I understand now that it's really like a community, like coming together and like appreciating each other. So I think it was really, really awesome to experience that.
Awesome. And I'm glad you get to be able to do that. This was your first Mardi Gras while being in Louisiana. Is it that recent?
This was my second.
Okay.
So with COVID and everything,
Yeah.
last year they were still kind of building back up with parades and everything. So last year I only went to 1 parade, and it wasn't as big as this year. This year was really big.
Gotcha. Okay. So you were down there in February last year, but this was your first actual Mardi Gras.
I would say, yeah, my first proper.
That is what I want to hear. You know what we should do?
Nice.
We should do it. I Wish You Were Dead on COVID, because like, COVID.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, we're done.
But yeah, so that's not Fia's swamp corner, but a little sliver of the swamp nonetheless.
Yes.
But yeah, so before we get into too much of the episode, do you have a little housekeeping for us, Fia?
I do, of course, every time. So don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Give us feedback about the show and any future topics that you would be interested in hearing. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, which we haven't had one in a while, so whenever you're ready, come to us and fill out a guest form, which all of that can be found in the show notes. And with that, Gavin, what's our next episode topic?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that we haven't had a guest episode in a while.
Ooh.
So, I mean, to be fair, I haven't actually asked the person yet, but so in the past, and if I were a better host, I would have looked up what episode it was, but we did an episode about the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and people seem to like that about museums, including hosts as well as some feedback from now number 1 fan of the pod, Molly.
Hey.
And
Shout out, Molly.
This past weekend, I was able to go and get a behind-the-scenes tour of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University in Philadelphia. And one of the main vertebrate paleontologists there is a pretty famous guy. So I'm hoping to have half the episode of us talk about the history of the Academy, and then some words from Dr. Ted Deschler. So
Wow.
Hopefully, I'll be able to make that happen. But my life is
Hopefully.
real chaotic right now, so we'll see. But nonetheless, we'll have an episode about the Academy because it is a really cool historic museum that I was really excited that I got to go to this past weekend.
That's awesome. Looking forward
And how
to
long
it.
were you there for? How long could
Just
someone
a
spend
day.
there?
Yeah, that was my first time that I had been there, and we were there so we went with my university is teaching our paleontology course this semester, and so it's about a 3 hour drive. So we left at like 7 in the morning and got there around 10ish, and then we were there until around 3. So a solid 5 or so hours.
Mm-hmm.
So
Cool.
obviously, as with any museum, you want to spend more time there. Like I didn't get to see too much of the non-paleontology stuff that they had.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask. Did you get to see the whole museum or just a part?
I get to see some other bits and pieces, but definitely not all of it.
Mm.
So we'll definitely be taking a trip back there at some point for sure.
I 100% believe that.
Yeah. So that's next episode. But before we get into the main topic for this episode, Mike, what happened today in history?
All right. So, you guys aware of anybody that's ever like disappeared?
What?
People that have disappeared. The most famous one in my mind is Amelia Earhart.
You are white hot. You are
Cool.
right. You are real close on for a couple different levels.
Dang.
Okay.
Any other guesses?
My guess
Oh,
was
yeah.
going to be that guy from the Tiger King that disappeared, but
Nope.
I think that's a little bit too early.
Carol Baskin's husband.
Yeah.
So okay, not to derail today in history a little bit.
No, please
My
do.
wife Liz is adamant that she did not kill him.
I mean, that
Uh-huh.
seems to be like the. Yeah,
I don't know.
it does.
I fully
like, no.
believed it, at least while I was watching the show.
Man.
While it was coming out. But we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Anywho,
I'm pretty sure that she didn't actually kill him, but it was a fun show to watch in March of 2020.
when there was
Yep.
everyone was starved for content.
The quarantine classic. I'll help you out a little bit here. Who is the only other pilot that you guys might be able to name? So there's Amelia Earhart.
Sully Sullenberger.
Okay, I guess there's 3 of them.
I don't know.
Yeah, no.
Charles Lindbergh.
Oh, okay.
And so on March 1st, 1932, Charles Lindbergh's 20-month-old son was kidnapped and abducted. And if you've ever heard anything about the Lindbergh baby,
I've definitely heard that phrase before. Yeah.
Yeah, so it comes from this when Charles Lindbergh had his son abducted, and a couple months later the child's corpse was discovered. Honestly, yeah, this is not like a happy ending to this particular story. This was a media sensation at the time. Again, it's the 1930s. Charles Lindbergh is one of the biggest celebrities in the world, and because of this case and all the attention around it, there wound up being a large movement by Congress to finally pass a federal kidnapping act, which was sometimes called the Little Lindbergh Law, which made transporting a kidnapping victim across state lines a federal crime. So I don't know exactly how much of a good news were to come out of this, but the Lindbergh kidnapping happened, was 91 years ago today.
There you go.
From when you guys are hearing this.
Yep.
And yeah, it is an interesting piece of American pop culture, if not a happy piece. At that, but yeah, that is our today in history. And now Gavin gets to talk to us about time or something.
Well, not yet.
Mike. You always
We
forget
have
about
Swamp
me.
Corner.
So I always feel like we do Swamp Corner at the end of the episodes. I always forget.
We did.
We used
for
to.
a little while. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I in my head they are still they're still at the end of the episode.
Right.
So I'm like, all right, here
I
we
think
go.
we did that. I think we made that switch while you were doing your summer hiking last year.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Well, now instead of talking about time, Fee is going to be talking about alligators.
Or something. Not
Close.
that distantly related.
Yep. So apparently winter is coming to an end here in Louisiana, and it's starting to get back up into the 70s and 80s again, which is absolutely lovely and something I've been looking forward to. But as winter is coming to an end, I have to say goodbye to the rare encounters from my favorite bird, the roseate spoonbill, which
They're very weird, but like weirdly
very
pretty.
weird. Yes, exactly. They're weird and awkward, but also cute and everything you could want. But anyways, they're a wading bird in the ibis and spoonbill family, and they get their name partly roseate because they're often bright pink, and then spoonbill because they have a long beak or bill that at the very end of it flattens out like a spoon. So it's like long and skinny and then round at the tip. And they're typically like 28 to 34 inches long and usually like 2 to 4 pounds. So they're pretty light, and I would say equivalent size of like a heron, but maybe a little smaller.
Mm-hmm.
But like the flamingo, or the American flamingo, their pink color comes from what they eat. So they get their coloration from the crustacean or whatever they eat, and their color can range from pale pink to bright magenta, depending on also their age, weather, and breeding and location. Unlike herons, though, spoonbills will fly with their necks and legs outstretched. So they look a little funky when they're flying, and you can definitely spot them out right away. Which is usually how I see them, because they'll be flying in the air and they don't look like anything else, and also they're bright pink.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're common in Texas, Florida, and Louisiana. Generally, though, they're in South America and coastal regions of the Caribbean. Usually, you only see the roseate spoonbill in Louisiana during the winter, colder months. They fly usually when they're migrating, but they'll make stops in the coast and hang out for a little while. They've also been known to fly way outside of their geographic range, including sometimes being spotted in New York. So, Mike, you can potentially see this.
All right.
I think that's always fun when you just like a bird is just really not where it's supposed to be. Like the famous one recently is that I think it's like a Steller's sea eagle that is normally in like the Pacific coast of like Russia and China, but just decided to take a trip all the way across North America and just like hung out in Maine for a while.
Right.
So weird, but I think that's always fun.
Yeah. So keep your eyes out for the roseate spoonbill. And with that, Gavin, take it away.
Yeah, so today we are talking about the Jurassic Period in our sort of ongoing series of going through every sort of slice of Earth history. We are more or less at the halfway point with that, considering we have many more slices, even though there's a lot less time as we get recent.
And also, what is time?
Exactly.
Can we have an episode on that?
No, because that's not particularly a geology question.
All right.
But yeah, so today we're talking about the Jurassic Period, and right before we started recording, I looked up of the dinosaurs that appear in Jurassic Park, at least the first one, how many of them are actually from the Jurassic Period. And there are 7 dinosaurs in that first movie, and only 2 of them are from the Jurassic Period.
Rough.
Yep. So, bummer. You really should not be calling your movie that, but it sounds better than Cretaceous Park. Anywho, the Jurassic Period was from 201 to 145 million years ago. So, a little less than 60 million years long. And so before the Jurassic period, there was the Triassic period, which we talked about in episode 98. And then after the Jurassic period was the Cretaceous, which is when most of the very famous dinosaurs, T-Rex, Velociraptor, etc., are from. We'll have an episode on that period at some point. And
Cool.
the Jurassic is the middle period of the Mesozoic era, often called sort of the Age of Reptiles. This is when all of your large things swimming around in the ocean were reptiles. You know, there were no whales. There were large marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. The large things on land were mostly reptiles like dinosaurs. The things flying around in the air were pterosaurs mostly, and then birds come in during the Jurassic period here, which we'll talk about. And birds are also reptiles. So basically, everything going on, it was just reptiles all the way down. And the Jurassic was sort of the middle time slice of this era. And it is really famous for a lot of reasons. It is when dinosaurs really took off, both figuratively and literally. Because like I said, birds really happen.
Cool.
This is when mammals really start looking like mammals. So lots of dinosaurs, lots of reptiles. Mammals, you can't forget about them either.
What do you mean they start looking like mammals?
They start like being much more recognizable as mammals. Like you'd be able to point at pretty much any mammal around during the Jurassic and be like, oh, you are probably some kind of rat or something, even though rats and rodents as we know them didn't exist yet. But in the Triassic period before this, there were some that would look pretty mammally. Like some of them might have had hair, but would just look very alien for being a mammal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The Jurassic period is also just generally when animals, like I was sort of talking about with mammals, start to look much more like they do today. And we'll get into some of the actual specifics of that as we go through. And then lastly, we're going to do a little geology here. The Jurassic period is really unique in that it is the only geologic period that does not have a defined end boundary.
Now, when you say defined end boundary, I'm assuming that like there's been sort of just like a consensus. We're going to put a number on it.
Right.
But there's no like, there's not maybe not a great reason for that number. Is what I'm assuming you mean by that.
A little bit. So let's do a little deep dive into why we draw boundaries where we do, why we call things the way we do. So each geologic period has a boundary with the periods right before and right after it. So that's usually just called the definition, but depending on what you use as your definition, it can mean a number of things. So what is typically referred to when you say the definition is usually the first appearance or disappearance of some marine invertebrate. Depending on when in time that is, that's usually an ammonite, which we've previously called swirly-tailed squid boys. A trilobite, which we've also previously called undersea Roombas. They're these little arthropod bug-like things that lived in the oceans. Conodonts, which are a weird type of primitive vertebrate that had some funky teeth that are really distinct and good for using for figuring out what time you're in. Or graptolites, which are these weird floaty things in the ocean that we don't have anymore. They're not important. If they're important, we'll have an episode about them at some point.
If they become important.
Right. But these particular groups of animals, they evolve very quickly. So meaning that each species is only around for a very small slice of time. And so if you find this particular species, you know when in time you are. They're called index fossils. And the boundary between one period and another is usually defined by the last appearance of this species and the first appearance of this other species. Usually it's a combination of species from a variety of different groups. So it's like ammonite A and trilobite B stopped showing up at 200 million years ago, and ammonite A and conodont A, ammonite B and conodont A show up at 200 million years. That's how we know we're in a new period.
Okay.
I feel like we've done an episode on index fossils, or they came up in another episode, because I know we've heard that term at
Yeah.
least once before.
Right. Yeah, I think we've had a whole episode about like the geologic timescale. I don't remember what episode it was, but we've had an episode about that before.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, the boundary to start the Jurassic period is defined by the first appearance of the ammonite subspecies. I'm going to butcher this because I didn't read it beforehand. Siloceras spile tyrolicum. Sure, that one. So the first time that ammonite subspecies shows up, that is when you know you are now in the Jurassic period. However, there is also what's called the Global Boundary Stratotype Section Endpoint, GSSP for short. That is an actual spot on a map that you can go to and point at the rocks and say, here is the actual physical boundary that is, in the case of the Jurassic period, 201.4 million years ago. You can say, wow, these rocks above it are younger, these rocks below that point are older. And every boundary has a spot like that. For example, that same boundary to start the Jurassic period is called this is a foreign language, so I'm probably not going to pronounce it right, but it is the Kujak section in the Karwendel Mountains, the northern calcareous Alps in Austria, and even has a like latitude, longitude coordinates, and those are just available. You can find them on Wikipedia. And so every boundary, except for the one to end the Jurassic period, has those two things. Fossils that you can say, when these ones stop showing up, that's the end, and a point that you can go and look at and put your hand on and say, this is when the Jurassic ends and the Cretaceous starts. That doesn't exist. Stuff has been proposed, but nothing has been fully approved yet by the scientific organization that defines these things. And we'll talk a bit more toward the end of the episode about why, because it's a large combination of things. The Jurassic is very weird in a lot of ways. So,
how so?
Why, thank you for asking. What was the world like in the Jurassic? Before we talk about the life, we have to talk about what the planet was doing, because the life on the planet responds to the things that the planet itself does. So, Pangaea, by the start of the Jurassic period, was well on its way to being rifted apart by the start of the period. The continents were still pretty close together, but things were definitely drifting apart. North America and then most of Eurasia was definitely disconnected. There was significant water between the northern continents and the southern continents, represented by everyone's favorite supercontinent, Gondwana, all of the southern continents today. And so all of this sort of pulling apart of the continents creates a lot of volcanoes, because when two continents move apart, stuff needs to come up to sort of take their place, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so all of this was just creating generally not awesome conditions. Giant volcanoes all across the world is not a great recipe for life.
I know, that sounds pretty awesome to me.
For life, it's pretty bad.
I mean, it's bad for life, but that sounds like a great plot to a movie.
Oh yeah, totally. I believe Tommy Lee Jones was actually in a movie called Volcano. Not an excellent movie science-wise, but a very fun movie. And plus, Tommy Lee Jones is just a good actor. But yeah, so all of these volcanoes just generally sort of made life on Earth pretty tough, generally. The climate was warmer than it is today, about 10 degrees warmer on average, 5 to 10 degrees. However, there were a number of really short cold snaps that lasted only a few hundred to a few thousand years. Those seem to be pretty common. There's evidence of what are called drop stones, which are basically, if you have a rock formation that is really fine-grained, like sand or silt, and then just with a giant boulder in the middle of it. That doesn't just come from nowhere. Most of the time, those boulders are stuck to glaciers that then drift out into the ocean and drop their stones as the glacier melts. So there's evidence of drop stones all throughout the Jurassic period. However, for most of the time, it was warm enough to have forests at the poles, which we don't have today. Obviously, if you've seen pictures or listened to our episode about Antarctica, you'd know that. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't cold at the poles. People kind of sometimes can think that when the world is generally warm, that means that there was no snow. And like where we are now, at least Mike and I, in sort of the temperate 40-degree, 50-degree latitude areas, there probably wouldn't have been much snow. But at the poles, they still don't get sunlight for, a third of the year or so. So we don't really understand how those environments worked if they just weren't getting sunlight, but there was still forest there. But
are there any like proposed hypotheses for that?
Probably it would have been just similar to a more extreme version of winter. How just the plants were very different at the time. So speaking of plants, we'll talk about some of the plants. The flowering plants, which are almost all the plants that you are thinking of, pretty much everything we eat is a flowering plant. The only things that come to mind for most people that are not flowering plants are like pine trees and all the various similar trees, spruces, firs. Ferns and mosses are also not flowering plants. So those were pretty much the only kinds of plants around at the time. And so pines and conifer trees are generally pretty good at that kind of environment. And they were globally dominant anyway. So they were probably what was making up all of those forests.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The world in general, though, was still, as much as it was a little bit warmer, it was quite dry. Since the continents were still pretty close together, which prevents weather and precipitation from getting really far inland. And so things would get a little bit cooler and a little bit wetter from the start to the beginning. So stuff would be a little more hospitable by the end. Going back to those plants, if you remember back to our episode about the Triassic, there was a big old mass extinction right at the end of the Triassic period to start off the Jurassic. And plants did not care. Plants did not seem to be bothered by that extinction. So the plant communities didn't really change all that much. Still mostly ferns, conifers, these interesting plants called cycads, which are, if you can imagine sort of a pine tree looking plant, but very squat. Instead of like a big tall trunk, it's just like this little pineapple shaped ball.
Oh.
Okay.
With then pine like or palm like fronds coming off the top of it. As I mentioned, flower. What?
I just said that's kind of cute.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, flowering plants were still not around yet, although they probably evolved from the conifer group sometime in the late Jurassic. So they might have been around at the very end, but we're not at all what all these animals and stuff on land were eating. Speaking of those animals, as I mentioned, the end Triassic mass extinction changed a lot of things, both in the oceans and on land. But we'll start in the oceans. Looking at you, Fia.
Yay!
In the oceans, it's sort of this weird in-between time where some of these older, like really iconic groups of previous periods are sort of just barely hanging on. Things like brachiopods, which were everywhere in times like the Permian period, the Carboniferous period. Mm-hmm. They are doing real bad, but still around. We still have them around today. But during this period, they are just really not doing well and are sort of just scraping by. Crinoids, which are really just starfish, we've talked about them quite a bit. They do really, really bad in the extinction, but actually do pretty well throughout the period. They actually recover pretty quickly. And we also get a lot of unfamiliar sort of versions of the major invertebrate groups that are common today. So the ones that are
Like
common today
what?
sort of start showing up, but they're just a little weird. Um, and so what did you say, Thea?
I'm sorry, I just said like what?
No, that's okay. Um, so just like weird versions of bivalves and stuff that,
Oh.
yeah, just sort of do slightly differently bivalve things. We'll talk about a particular group much more in the Cretaceous episode, um, but that just don't show some of the modern features that we have with them today. I'm not going to go into all of the groups because that would just take forever.
Yeah.
Uh, but a couple of key highlights is that reefs were mostly made up of things like sponges. See last
Yay.
episode. Um, and then some early versions of the type of coral we have now. Uh, so coral, you sort of think, coral is coral. Coral is a very simple animal, but they didn't show up until the very end of the Triassic period, somewhere in there, and then start to become much more common here in the Jurassic. However, these reefs are sort of notable for having a really high amount of like bacterial components, which is kind of strange
Yeah.
because bacteria tend to be pretty tasty for small invertebrates. So that sort of tells me that the small invertebrates were just not doing great in general. Crustaceans really take off during this time, and we see the first of the many, many times that evolution will give us crabs. Crabs, just the crab shape is a very memeable thing because evolution has produced a crab shape like 5 or 6 different times.
Really?
Yeah. And so the first crabby things show up here in the Jurassic period.
What else
So,
falls
for
in the
example,
category of crustaceans? Like you've got crabs, lobsters,
Shrimp.
shrimp. Okay, shrimp.
Like crustacean, you said?
Right, that's
yeah,
what Gavin
there's
said, I think.
yes,
I was
crustaceans.
like,
So it's weird. So a lot of the things that you would call crabs are not crabs. Like I don't like hermit crabs are not actually crabs.
Wait,
Um,
what?
yeah.
I
Wait,
think
stop the
like
podcast. What?
so I mean by true crabs, I mean just like in the group that is the actual true crabs. My crustacean taxonomy is not very developed. I don't know which
Mhm.
particular groups are the true crabs. I just know what I read in some papers online.
Jeez. Okay.
Yeah.
um,
Wow.
but yeah, so the crab shape has evolved like in like the true crabs, the hermit crab sort of group. I think like multiple groups of like lobsters have become crabs. But the first crabs that we know of show up here in the Jurassic.
Mhm.
Ammonites, those swirly shelled squid boys, were almost entirely wiped out at the end of the Triassic period with that big extinction, with only a single family surviving. But they rebound really quickly and then become just like everywhere throughout the entire Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. Uh, Other cephalopods diversify as well. So these are your actual squids, octopus, cuttlefish. A very iconic group called the belemnites appear. So these are like squid, but with a much more solid um, structure, sort of in their mantle, sort of the main quote unquote body part of the squids. The first known octopus is from the Middle Jurassic, but octopus are very soft and squishy, so their fossil record is basically non-existent. So they may have been around way before this, but we just don't know. Lastly, for the at least marine invertebrates and Forphia, some
Thank you.
bivalves were hit pretty hard diversity-wise by the extinction at the beginning, but weren't hurt very bad ecologically. So just the number of species went down, but the number of niches that they were filling did not very much. So they rebounded like pretty quickly back up to their previous diversity.
So, Gavin, I have a question that I've been pondering now that we've
Yeah.
started talking about crustaceans. Um, So you said earlier that in this period it was hotter, right?
Yes, not by a lot, but yeah.
So do you know if the shell building organisms in this time period were using calcium carbonate as their building blocks, or is that not known?
Yeah, they were.
And so I guess in terms of,
Arthropods do it a little differently than things like
yeah,
mollusks but yeah, in general, yeah.
yeah. So I'm just like pondering in terms of right now how like warmer temperatures are going to cause ocean acidification. It's going to make things that build shells harder to build.
Yeah. And so that's like a really common sort of thing that happens with extinctions, is that the oceans get acidic, and it doesn't, you think of sort of dropping acid on something and it dissolving it. That's not really what happens with ocean acidification. It just
Right,
makes it more energetically costly for them to build their shell.
right,
Um,
right.
and so that was probably happening a bit, but this was sort of like the norm, unlike today where the temperature is
Okay.
increasing much faster. And
Hmm.
so I'm sure that had something to do with it. I'm sure if they
Yeah.
are adapted to warmer temperatures, it's no different
Okay.
than sort of just like a bivalve that is native to
Right.
like the seas around like Greenland versus one that's native to
Yeah.
the Caribbean. I'm sure
Hmm.
they have
Hmm.
similar challenges to that.
Okay. Yeah. That's just something that I've been stewing on for a few minutes and trying to comprehend.
Yeah, no, that's a good
Uh,
question. Uh, And then getting into some vertebrates in the ocean, fish were doing some weird things. The first real true sharks show up here, and the first rays, stingrays, manta rays, stuff like that, show up in the Jurassic. And then even some familiar groups, like the group that includes great whites and mako sharks, show up here. So very
Whoa.
familiar looking sharks. The lobe-finned fish, which are things like your coelacanth or your lungfish, were pretty widespread. Both of those coelacanth and lungfish being common in both marine and freshwater environments. However, today there are a total of like 9 species of lobe-finned fish. These are the ones that eventually, or definitely by this point, had given rise to vertebrates or tetrapods, things on land with arms and legs. The ray-finned fish, which is pretty much every fish you're thinking of, were becoming more like today, but their major shifts wouldn't happen until a little bit later. However, some relatives of things like gar or sturgeon were pretty widespread by this time. And then a real quick mention of one of my favorite animals that I kind of forgot was here in the Jurassic, which is a big old giant cool fish. It is the largest bony fish that we know of. It's called Leedsichthys, and it was gigantic. Maybe.
How big is gigantic?
Well, that's been up for debate for a while.
Oh, we
So
have
the
a good
full
debate. All
yes,
right.
the full species name is Leedsichthys problematicus, which is very fitting because despite there being over 70 individuals found, none of them have been complete or even like nearly complete. So it's really hard to estimate its size with much confidence because of that sort of just lack of confidence. Size ranges for this thing have been all over the place. Uh,
Mhm.
Early estimates put it at around 30 feet, which isn't crazy. That's, slightly bigger than like a great white shark. So big, but not huge.
Mhm.
However, in the 1980s, about 100 years after it was first found and named, we found some more specimens. They gave us a better picture, and studies from around this time gave size ranges ranging anywhere from 45 feet to 115 feet. So, yeah,
That's
pretty
pretty
big ranges.
big.
Yeah, so even 45 feet, that is very big. Let alone 115 feet, that is like bigger than a blue whale, or
Oh,
in the same
wow.
ballpark as a blue whale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Um,
now we're talking big.
right. Some of the more recent studies have been much more conservative with it, putting it sort of in that 40, 50 foot range. And so, like pretty much all the big things in the ocean, like giant things, this was a filter feeder. And so, this was more or less the same size as whale sharks today. So whale sharks are marginally bigger than this, but that same ballpark.
Yeah.
So just a neat, weird guy. Moving to some non-fish, marine reptiles doing pretty well. Plesiosaurs doing great and start to really diversify in both their shape and their size.
What are the
Ichthyosaurs.
plesiosaurs again?
Plesiosaurs are the sort of Loch Ness monster looking
Ah.
guys. Yeah, so they're like I said, here's when they start to really diversify in their shape too. So some of them didn't have long necks like that. Some of them had like really, really big heads and tiny, tiny necks. But they are the ones that sort of swim by like moving four flippers like they're flying almost. That's very unique to this group. Ichthyosaurs are the first, big group of marine reptiles to appear. They show up in like the early Triassic and right after the extinction. So right at the very beginning of the Jurassic is when they hit their peak diversity. And then they kind of just like sort of trickle down in their diversity as the period goes on. But some really big ones still in that, 30, 35 foot range, which for a non-fish in the ocean is pretty big.
Yeah.
All right, that's enough in the oceans, though. Sorry, Fia.
Oh.
All right, now we're talking about some air breathers.
Yes, absolutely. So, very briefly, before we get into the vertebrates that everyone wants to talk about, insects doing some weird stuff at this time. Beetles, which are the most diverse group of life today, diversify a lot by the end of the period. The first butterflies and moths are known from the very beginning of this period, but insects don't preserve well as fossils, so they might have been around before this. Just you can't talk about paleontology and environments and stuff without mentioning insects, so obligatory insect mention. So, back to the vertebrates, the good stuff. Basically, every large-scale group of vertebrates that are around today got its start in the Jurassic.
Wow.
The first frogs, which are crazy diverse, although becoming more or less and less diverse by the day. Sadly, frogs are not doing well these days. But the first frogs show up in the Jurassic. The first true turtles show up in the Jurassic. The first true lizards show up in the Jurassic. The first birds and the first mammals show up in the Jurassic.
Wow.
So basically, any kind of animal you can, at least on land, any vertebrate you can look at today showed up here for the first time, at least their sort of main group. A little bit of context. So at the end of the Triassic period, all of the synapsids, so basically the ancestors of mammals, all of them that weren't very closely related to mammals went extinct. And in episodes 35 and 53, we talked about the whole evolution of mammals. So if you aren't familiar, check out those episodes. And all of them sort of are gone by the time we get mostly into the Triassic.
Question.
Yeah.
Are there any primates yet in this?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope, the first primates show up debatably around 50 to 60 million years ago. For sure by 50, maybe 60 or a little earlier.
Okay.
Yeah. So, mammal relatives that aren't quite mammals were sort of the main land vertebrates in the Permian. They sort of go by the wayside in the Triassic. In the Triassic, archosaurs, which are the group of reptiles that includes crocodilians, dinosaurs, and birds, they were the really dominant ones, but within that, the crocodilian ancestors were sort of the really successful dominant ones. And dinosaurs were a really, relatively minor part of their ecosystems until that big old mass extinction comes through at the end of the Triassic, and dinosaurs come out of that like gangbusters. Throughout the Jurassic, diversified and reversed that trend of them being minor, and basically every niche that a vertebrate can fill, besides swimming, weirdly, all of that is filled by dinosaurs throughout the Jurassic period. Yeah. They take over basically everything on land in the Jurassic. And so and not just like, over time, but like basically immediately. Right at the beginning of the period, dinosaurs were the major predators, with theropod dinosaurs, the big, two-legged meat-eating ones. They were pretty large. They were like bear-sized by
Whoa.
like right afterward, which is, the biggest land predators today are bears. Um, as well as the major herbivores being the sauropod dinosaurs, the big, long neck, uh, giant, largest land animals ever, already being pretty close to elephant size.
Hmm.
So, like, at the start of dinosaurs being the main animals in their environments, they were already topping out what we have today.
Killing it.
Yeah. And
And
then throughout
so,
the Jurassic. Oh, go ahead.
are you gonna? I might be jumping ahead, but are there reasons why people? Do people know why they just decided to start booming in this time, like
Um,
in the
there
environment?
are lots of theories or hypotheses, but I couldn't find a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it was mostly just certain adaptations allowed them to do better during the extinction. So they were able to
Gotcha.
just sort of take over for those crocodilian cousins that didn't do as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So then that's like I said, the start. Throughout the whole Jurassic, we get some of the most famous dinosaurs, particularly from here in North America. Um, for example, some names you may have heard of: Allosaurus was a big predatory dinosaur. So these are all right here theropods. Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus, Megalosaurus, which I believe was the first dinosaur ever named, is from this
Cool.
period, and
Hmm.
Dilophosaurus, the one that could spit venom in Jurassic Park, even though it couldn't, and it was way bigger. Um, all of those, Jurassic period. Basically, all of your famous sauropods are from this period, like Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Brontosaurus, if that's your real name, um, as well as,
Debatable.
yeah. So back when all of these dinosaurs were being named was not a great time for science. It was the Bone Wars, and
The
so,
Bone Wars.
yep. And so the two main people that were fighting the Bone Wars, the Bone Warriors, if you will, they wanted to name as many species as possible to one up the other guy.
Uh,
And even though Brontosaurus was extremely similar to another genus called Apatosaurus, which was named first and therefore gets the precedent in how we name things. They named it Brontosaurus anyway, and for whatever reason, Brontosaurus just sounded cooler than Apatosaurus, so that's what stuck in the media.
hmm.
Um, and then sometime later, they realized, oh, these two are the same, and
Hmm.
since Apatosaurus was named first, that's the name that stays. So, depending on who you ask, because there's some evidence, depending on who you ask, that Brontosaurus should be its own genus. Um, we'll see, though. I don't have strong
Yeah.
opinions on dinosaur stuff, so
Yeah. Sorry to get off
You don't
topic.
say.
no, that's okay. I'll let the dinosaur folks figure that out. But if Brontosaurus was real, it was here, as well as just some really fun names. So, Cetiosaurus, which is the whale lizard, because they thought, well, things this big, it must be a whale or live in the ocean like a whale. As well as Giraffatitan, which is Brachiosaurus, but in Africa. Uh, the Stegosaurs, so Stegosaurus and its relatives, are pretty much only found, but definitely their main diversity is here in the Jurassic period. And then some of the earliest members of some groups that would become famous later. So the ceratopsians, like Triceratops, their earliest relatives were here. The ornithopods, which are sort of the duck-billed dinosaurs, their first relatives here. Ankylosaurs, the big armored club-tailed dinosaurs, related to things like Stegosaurus. They just barely show up here. So, particularly here in North America, almost all of like the really famous ones besides T-Rex are from the Jurassic period.
Wow.
Yeah. As well as just some real weirdos. Just some absolute freaks.
Like what?
This is what I want to hear.
Yeah.
So, a few quick highlights. The scientific name that I think I hate the most. It's called Gigantspinosaurus. And I hate it because there should be a letter between the T and the S, but there's not. It's just Gigantspinosaurus. I don't know why that bothers me so much, but it does.
Gigantspinosaurus.
I mean, consistency.
Right. It would just
Doesn't flow
sound so
well.
much better if it was Gigantospinosaurus.
Yeah.
But it's not. Anywho, still a really cool dinosaur because it is a stegosaur. So it had, think Stegosaurus, but instead of the plates on its back, those were spikes, just like the ones on the tail. And it also had these gigantic spines, hence the name, coming off of each shoulder. So like each shoulder had like a 3-foot long backward curving spike coming off of each shoulder. Very strange. And like the pointy part was pointing backward, so it's not like it was, using it to like fight off things. Really not sure what it was doing. A whole family of theropod dinosaurs called the Scansoriopterigidae, say that 5 times fast. This was another separate group of dinosaurs trying to be birds. And
did they succeed?
No, they did not. But they did it in a real weird way. Birds, we've talked about birds a whole bunch on this podcast. Birds make their wing by basically fusing all of their fingers together to give support to all their feathers, and that's how they make their flight surface. This group had bat wings. They just stretched a big flap of skin between all their fingers. And it's not they probably couldn't like fly, but lived in trees and were pretty good at like gliding with accuracy.
Is it like a flying squirrel kind of situation?
Right, but it yes and no, because flying squirrels actually have quite a lot of control over how they fly, but this group even structurally looked a lot like birds. But then when they stretched out their wings, it would look like a bat. The most famous one, I think, at least that I've heard of the most, is called Yi-Chi. So the genus is Yi, just Y-I, and then the species is Qi. I think it's the shortest scientific name of any species. But it's like crow size, so like not a small bird either. But just these absolute weirdos that, like, if these guys had done a little better, our birds could look like that instead.
Oh.
Very strange, like horror show kind of thing. Birds, I think, are pretty. These guys are weird. Like I mentioned earlier, Giraffe Titan, just a giant sauropod that they found in Africa, and they're like, well, it's got a long neck. Let's name it after a giraffe.
Oh.
And then one of my absolute favorites, because it's just so strange, called Mamenchisaurus.
Does it look like a mummy?
No, so it's actually spelled with an A. But this guy is so weird because its neck is so absurdly long.
Really? I gotta look this up.
So its neck is about half of its length.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so it's so absurd. Its neck is probably like 40 feet long. And that's not an exaggeration.
Are you gonna be okay?
Yeah, I'm just
that gasp.
I'm looking at a picture right now, and it's absurd.
Yeah. So its neck, at least depending on the species, I think there's 4 species, but the biggest one, its neck was like 12 or 13 meters.
Wow.
Yeah. So just an absurd weirdo.
All neck.
All neck. Neck for days. Its neck's all the way down. So, as I mentioned earlier, getting away from some of the animals, this is just sort of highlighting some of the diversity in the Period. But as I mentioned before, how it doesn't have an ending. So let's talk a bit more about that after I explained it a little earlier. So why is this boundary hard to define? Why don't we have one yet? At other boundaries, it can be easier because they were exciting, and so stuff happened there that we can clearly see. Big asteroid hits the planet and covers the globe in like a layer of ash that you can see. Cool, you can just find that boundary and point at it and say, there it is. Giant continent-scale volcanoes erupting. That produces a lot of ash and a lot of chemical stuff that you can like test chemically in the rocks. That's really easy to see. Long story short, the Jurassic doesn't have an end date formally yet because it was kind of boring.
Oh.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem boring.
Well, the ending was boring compared to some other periods.
Okay.
Mm.
So the main thing is that all of these things, like at the end of the Cretaceous when the asteroid hits, at the end of the Permian, giant volcanoes erupting everywhere, that leaves a global trace that you can see. Whereas in the Jurassic, if you find Jurassic rocks, they will have different chemical signals. So there's not one thing to say this is what happened here, which makes it harder because the requirements, the G in GSSP, that sort of spot on a map where you can go and find the boundary, the G stands for global. And there isn't a global thing to point to here, which is why we don't have one yet. But there is some interesting things going on with life at this time. So there is what we call a turnover, not the dessert kind. Which in
what about the football kind?
Much, I wish it was the dessert kind. Apple turnover.
Oh, so good.
So what this means is that there was just a lot of extinction, but there was also a lot of like new species popping up. So it's, replacement was pretty high, but things were still going extinct at like a higher than normal rate, which is unusual compared to like, the major mass extinctions.
Yeah.
And this one is also just particularly weird because every other boundary in the Mesozoic era is one of like the major mass extinctions.
Huh.
To start the Triassic, the biggest mass extinction. To end the Triassic, another really big mass extinction. And then to end the Cretaceous, another big mass extinction. So it's just surrounded by really eventful things, and then there's this one that is much less eventful. So it's hard to try to pin down exactly when this was because of that. However,
I have a question.
Yeah.
So why even have a Jurassic Period?
Because we can clearly see that the life was different.
Okay.
Different kinds of, mostly dinosaurs, but also I'm sure lots of just different groups of things in marine invertebrates. That's typically how like large-scale biodiversity stuff in the fossil record is done, is with marine invertebrates, just because there's a lot of them and they preserve way better than things on land do.
Yeah.
So that's why there is a distinction between all these. So let's talk a little bit about this turnover here. So turtles in general survive, but the types of turtles before and after were different, just different groups. Mammals survive, but their teeth are structured differently before and after. There's these really odd group that actually would sort of continue until, relatively recently, all things considered, but were sort of the main group of mammals before this in the Triassic, and then, or in the Jurassic, and then were not nearly as big and exciting afterward, called the multituberculates, that had these very funky shaped teeth. After the extinction, or once we get into the Cretaceous, their teeth become more standard to what we see as the general mammal tooth structure today. Insects sort of their ecological roles before and after are quite a bit different. Leaf eating was much more common after this. We don't really know why, because we don't see much in the plants that should suggest that, but something made insects shift that way. Reefs were made of different animals before and after. After, in the Cretaceous, spoilers for when we get to that episode, reefs were mostly made out of bivalves for a time.
How about that?
Interesting.
Yeah, not a group of bivalves that we have today, which is pretty neat. And global ecology, just sort of getting back to Fia's point there about why are they different, global ecology was just different before and after. And way back when people were naming these periods, they were different enough for them to call them different things.
Okay.
And this complicated ecological shift globally, but not quite a mass extinction. It happened over a much longer span of time. Mass extinctions tend to happen in like less than 1 million years, whereas this was a really contracted period over like 25 million years. And so, why? Why all this funky weirdness? Mostly, the continued breakup of Pangea. As the continents break up, there's just a lot of general catastrophes, eruptions, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And also some funky stuff going on with the oceans. There were lots of like really extreme sea level drops during this time, which messes a lot with shallow marine environments. Shallow marine environments are like some of the most productive and some of the most diverse environments. But when sea levels drop, that sort of area that is shallow marine, there's just much less of that space for them to take up. When sea level drops like that, it can isolate these pockets of shallow marine and cause some funky geochemical isolation and evolutionary isolation in these pockets of shallow marine. Oceans in general became anoxic and euxinic, so not much oxygen, and then also every now and then became very sulfurous. Not quite sure why, probably just from some extreme volcanism. And then ocean stagnation, which is about as bad as things can kind of get. Ocean stagnation is real bad. It's basically when the ocean currents stop flowing.
Dear.
Yeah,
You don't want that.
That has happened a handful of times in Earth history, and it's always bad. Because it basically means that nutrients can't flow from one part of the ocean to another. Mostly from like deep ocean to shallower ocean. So that just makes life real hard in the ocean. Like I said, all of that volcanism from the continents moving around. And then I actually did see quite a bit of evidence for potentially 3 asteroid impacts around this time.
Whoa.
One was cited as maybe bigger than the one that ended the Cretaceous period and killed off the dinosaurs. Yeah.
Okay.
So, again, I haven't heard all that much about it since, so I don't know how well supported that is. But
yeah.
And so that's why, none of this seemed to be large enough to give a consistent global geochemical signal. And the Jurassic just kind of ends with a little bit of a whimper. And what happened after this big turnover? You'll have to listen to our future episode about the Cretaceous to find out.
Hey.
And we will get to that episode in the future. But until then, it has been episode 107 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Thank you so much, Gavin and Fia, for this episode, and we'll see all of you guys in 2 weeks. Until then, take care, everybody.
Bye.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.